find comics, legends like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, or teams like Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams might come to mind. When we think of the Golden Age, we might think of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, or Bill Finger and Bob Kane, who defined the superhero genre. Sadly, arguably most important figure who created the template for those that followed has largely been forgotten by the general audiences. A man whose bold risks and big visions changed comics as we know them today. We're talking about Major Malcom Wheeler-Nicholson, founder of National Allied Publications and Detective Comics Inc., which later became DC Comics. Born Malcolm Strain on January 7, 1890 in Tennessee to suffragette mother Antoinette Wheeler and father Louis Strain. The family faced hardships in 1891, facing a combination of financial struggles, and with the death of their daughter, the couple wound up splitting shortly after. Antoinette later took her children to New York City and later Portland, Oregon, where she took up journalism, writing for a women's magazine. She later remarried to a teacher named Thomas Nicholson. The Major enjoyed his youth, riding horses, and attended military school in New York. And he was a very accomplished soldier. He became the youngest major in his cavalry at age 27. Clearly, his mother's activism had an impact on him, as he was often challenging prejudice through his actions and his writings. He commanded the African American Buffalo Soldiers in the Philippines and even penned an open letter to President Warren G. Harding in defense of harassment he and his fellow junior officers faced. And his critiques of the military led to some serious problems for the Major. His accusations that Prussianism, favoritism, and inefficiency ruled in the treatment of junior officers in the Army, he made, regardless of the consequences to himself, for the good of the service. Quoted from the New York Times from February 6, 1922, "My own case started with a scandal in the Philippines involving a colonel now in the Army, resulting in persecution that followed me to Colbans, where I was in command of the cavalry squadron, following me back to Camp Dix in Washington." He went on to name senators with an interest in his case, as well as senior officers who stood in his way. One of them being General Fred Sladen. General Sladen made an efficiency report against the Major, claiming his cavalry squadron was below average, which official records disproved. The Major sued Sladen for slander, though these charges were dropped. The Major was shot in what his family believes was an assassination attempt. Though he recovered from his injuries, his military career was unfortunately dead. In 1922, he was convicted of violating the 96th Article of War by publishing his letter to the president. The Major resigned from the Army in 1923 and, seeing the potential in comics, decided to shift focus to his writing. Having written nonfiction about the military and pulp adventure in magazines, the Major wanted to bring heroes to the world in a very, very dark time. Comics at the time were primarily reprints of news strips, and the Major actually caught some criticism at the time for wanting to print original stories. And that's because newsstands were afraid of stocking untested material. And it's just crazy to me how 100 years later, we are in the same situation and nobody can make any original stories. But despite these criticisms, the Major persisted and he released his first comic book in 1935, New Fun Comics, which ran for 6 issues before renaming to More Fun Comics. And it's believed that only 10 to 15 copies exist of each. The Major received a submission from a young writer featuring a character known as Dr. Occult, which was published in New Fun number 6. The story was credited to Ledger and Ruths, a pen name for Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. The Major's second magazine was originally released as New Comics in December 1935 and was renamed to New Adventure Comics with issue 12 and later Adventure Comics with issue 35, which went on to be one of the longest running comic series of all time. The Major's final comic was Detective Comics, which released with a cover date of March 1937. In debt to printing plant owner and magazine distributor Harry Donenfeld, the Major was forced into a partnership with Donenfeld in order to release Detective Comics, and he launched Detective Comics Inc. with Donenfeld's attorney, Jack Leibowitz, listed as a co-owner. As America carried through the Depression, the Major's debts eventually caught up to him, and he was forced into bankruptcy. And in 1938, the Major was left with no choice but to sell his companies to Donenfeld. Letting comics go, the Major returned to writing stories about war and critiques of the American military. Although the Major was not around for the debut of Superman or Batman, his innovation shook the industry and changed how we read comics forever. What I find most inspiring about the Major is that he was not in it for the fame or the glory. He was just a man who wanted to use his voice to help those who needed it and to inspire hope. This was a man who lost everything but left behind a legacy greater than anyone could have imagined. Everything we know about superhero comics today is thanks to Major Malcom Wheeler-Nicholson, a true American hero.